Lovelies, and welcome to what may or may not be the last in the Dark Tower retrospectives. This is certainly dealing with the final book in the series, which is Book 7, just simply called The Dark Tower, for obvious reasons. This is the sort of end of the mythology, but not quite, not really. You'll sort of see what I mean when you read it. By the way, I am going to assume that you've read the book, so we are going to be talking about the ending and the metaphysics and what it implies, so if you haven't read the books, I'd suggest you go and do so, because this one does tie it all up and has a... I wouldn't say it's a twist ending as such, it's actually kind of obvious, given the nature of this multiverse and the metaphysics that King sets up. It kind of ends in the only way it can. That said, this is the book which has got the hardest work to do, because it has to tie up so many loose ends. It has to tie up all of the metaphysics, all of the character arcs, and whether it does so successfully largely depends on who you go to and who you ask. I mean, it's very divisive, the end of the Dark Tower. There is the consistent trope that King can't write endings. And I see why that trope exists. There are a lot of King's works where the end is kind of a damp squib. You know, you get great characters, great setup, great situations, really vivid, interesting settings and monsters and conditions, brilliant set pieces, but then the ending is kind of rushed. A really good example is the Book of The Shining. I really find the end of The Shining, the book, to be really problematic, whereas I find the film to be fantastic in its ambiguity. The ending of the book I just dislike. I just don't like. I don't think it works. It's just one of those things, and it's sometimes it's legitimate, sometimes it isn't. There are actually, I would say, there are more books that have decent endings or appropriate endings than not. It's just that very often there are certain iconic works that stand out that have truly terrible endings. A really good example is The Stand. The Stand has, I would argue, a terrible ending. I mean, it's just flat out terrible. It's the hand of, if you again, assuming you've read The Stand, so spoilers, but it is literally, I mean, the term Deus Ex Machina, it's literally that. I mean, King takes the Deus Ex Machina and makes it absolutely literal, as in the hand of God reaches down and actually saves everything or stops the really terrible thing from happening. And it's like, well, A, it's a cop-out, and B, why the fuck didn't God just do that? Huh? Instead of putting everyone through all that suffering and whatnot in the first place. It's just one of those Deus Ex Machinas that really doesn't work. I personally really like the ending to the Dark Tower. I really like it, because it's not an ending at all. It's one of those circular narratives where it loops back around upon itself. So it ends where it begins. That's how the metaphysics works. But there is this really subtle suggestion that this time around, when the story continues the next time, then things are going to go differently. It's almost like the Dark Tower is creating a paradox in reality around itself, which is what sustains it against entropy and destruction, because the Dark Tower is the linchpin of all reality, and Roland is the cipher for that, which is actually really interesting. People find it very difficult because, well, for one thing, there's the endings of the other characters. Now, there have been prophecies and signals and suggestions of what is going to happen to all of the characters surrounding Roland Deschain. From the very beginning, we know that his original quartet, they all died. They all either went mad, they killed themselves, got themselves killed, or Roland had to kill them, you know? And it was a very bad ending. And sadly, and we've already seen throughout the series that the quartet that he has now, Eddie Dean, Susanna, Jake Chambers, the Billy Bumbler Oi, and Roland himself, they echo the quartet that he had before. It's almost like they're not reincarnations of his original quartet. It's not that. It's just the innate poetry and mythic nature of the multiverse they live in has contrived to make it so. They are living myths, and in this book, as before, they become increasingly and escalatingly aware of that. As a result, the endings of the characters do sadly echo those of Roland's original quartet. These characters who you've really loved. I mean, for me, the most endearing is probably Eddie, because he's also the most problematic. You know, he's a guy who doesn't really fit in with Roland's quartet, and yet fits in entirely. It's a very unusual. He's a very real character in a very unreal, fantastical world, and it works very, very well. But yeah, these characters don't come to good ends as such. Certainly not within the path they're following with Roland. I mean, King does throw them a bone at one point, so they do get a kind of, despite the bad endings they come to, they do get their almost not happily ever after, but they do get some kind of a kind of renaissance, I suppose, as a result of what Roland does with the Dark Tower. You do probably the saddest is the ending for Jake Chambers, because the ending for Jake Chambers, actually King weaves in real life events with this. Again, it's another example of King inserting himself into the narrative, which makes sense. He actually uses the crash. Stephen King was involved in a really bad accident at one point about 10 years ago. A drunk driver hit him in a van and almost killed him. He was in a really bad way for a very, very, very long time, and he's still suffering with the fallout of that. And he weaves that accident into this story, and unfortunately Jake kind of saves him but ends up sacrificing himself as a result, and that's kind of the point and the purpose of Jake. And it's really interesting that Roland has a moment where he's almost going to kill King. He's almost going to kill him and end it all, because Jake and Roland's relationship is really intense. It's very paternal, and it's really, Jake has become almost like the driving force for Roland. He's become the reason that he's continuing along the way, and that he wants to do more than just end the Man in Black. Initially, it's all about vengeance. He just wants to kill the Man in Black, and that's it. And just look upon the tower. He doesn't want to save it. He doesn't want to sustain reality. He doesn't believe it can be done. But Jake kind of brings him round to the notion that there's potential, there's possibility, there's life after, if the tower stands. So he expands Roland's horizons a little bit and becomes the driving motive force behind the quest. And his death is probably the saddest point in the entire book. It really is awful, especially considering it's kind of. It occurs at around the same time as a really terrible birth. I mean, we left the last book with Maya, the mother of one, the demonic entity that had possessed Susanna Dean, but which is now separate from her, giving birth to a child who is simultaneously Roland's, also the Crimson King's. It's this strange sort of commingling of all of their essences. Its name is Mordred, of course, from Arthurian, again from Arthurian legend. The bane of King Arthur, his illegitimate son, who was sired with his sister, interestingly, in the original mythology. And Mordred is born to kill Roland. That's his entire purpose, and also to open the tower, because he's of the line of Eld, the same bloodline as Roland. He can actually open the Dark Tower. It will open to him, and that's entirely what the intention behind Mordred is. Unfortunately, apparently he's born prematurely, and there's something wrong with him. He's not entirely the Antichrist that he's supposed to be. He's one of the more disturbing elements in this book. He's a child who can take on the form, something resembling his father, so he becomes like a creature from the primordial Lovecraftian state before all of reality, which is what the Crimson King wants to bring back about. It's the state of monsters and insanity from Lovecraft, essentially. So Mordred can shapeshift into this giant spider, which is really kind of distressing and disturbing. You get the end of Walter, of the Man in Black, this Randall Flagg, this omnipresent man who has been the devil, who has been a monster in so many realities, who has seen entire realities collapse, who has orchestrated the collapse of entire histories and civilizations, is undone in this book. And you actually get in this book the background for Walter as well. You find out where he comes from, who he is, and it deliberately, instead of making him this epic evil, it deliberately downplays him. King has always got this thing about evil actually being a lot stupider and a lot more myopic and a lot less profound than it wants you to believe that it is. And that is encapsulated in Walter. He's actually just a petty, broken, abused man. That's what you find out. He's a man who ran away from home when he was very young, an abusive home in one of the many realities out there, and has had nothing but disappointment, abuse, and despair heaped upon him, and in the end has just become totally nihilistic, has just given himself over to the chaos, to the Crimson King. However, it's revealed in this book that he's got another agenda. He actually wants to take Mordred, or maybe even kill Mordred, and take his foot, take the foot that has the mark of Eld upon it, which will allow him to open the Dark Tower, and thereby use the Dark Tower himself, but essentially become a dark god over all of reality. He can reshape reality from within the Dark Tower. Unfortunately, he does that thing that evil often does. He overestimates himself. When he comes to Mordred is just a baby, and he is wearing a hood which he believes can protect him from Mordred's influence, because Mordred is phenomenally powerful. He can actually influence the minds of those around him and make them do things. He can actually control them in the same way the Crimson King can. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. He thinks it's working. He thinks that it's actually insulating him from Mordred, and Mordred is just reading his mind like a book, and eventually devours him. Just devours him on the spot. He turns into the spider and just orders him to feed him his eyes. He actually has Randall Flagg rip his own eyes out and feed Mordred his eyes. And that's the end. That's the end of Randall Flagg. He doesn't go much further than that. Again, it's one of those things that people often don't like. The ending of Randall Flagg, this epic monster from so many, who's the ultimate bad guy, the ultimate antagonist from The Stand and from multiple other books as well, just ends in this very kind of slightly silly way, in a way. I mean, he overestimates himself and underestimates Mordred, Also, he overestimates his own part in the narrative. He thinks that he's got to go on because Roland still has to follow him, that he's still playing that part. It's just not the case. He's done. This is the end of his road, And it's a bizarrely sad moment for him. It's a bizarrely sad moment that this is the end for this phenomenal force of entropy and evil. And he's replaced by Mordred, of course. It's an interesting take that King has got, There's a lot of the book that is very underplayed, massively underplayed. You'd expect it to be huge. You'd expect it to be phenomenally epic, and for there to be a showdown between the Crimson King, this ultimate force of evil. Doesn't happen. Just doesn't happen. In fact, when you meet the Crimson King, when the Crimson King is like the ultimate manifestation of all negativity in all of King's multiverse. He is the creature behind almost all of the negative aspects in almost every book King has ever written, or at least he's the culmination of them. And he's kind of nothing in this book. He is, when they find him, well, actually when Roland finds him, because by that point he's basically on his own, there's not much left of him. He's gone mad. He's actually murdered most of his followers, and he's become a prisoner in the Dark Tower itself. He's sealed outside on this balcony of the Dark Tower, and he's taken the form of this mad old man who's just throwing explosives from this tower, trying to prevent Roland from reaching it. And he can't actually get a bead on him. And in the end, the way he does away with the Crimson King is actually kind of ingenious. It actually relates to Hearts in Atlantis, and a character who goes missing in that, who turns up in this story. He's like kind of the last of Roland's quartet. And in Hearts in Atlantis, the character's a boy. He's just a very, very young boy who has sort of this very odd power of being able to draw reality. He's able to sort of alter reality by the drawings that he's got. He's basically one of the chosen children, like Danny Torrance or like Jake Chambers. He's got the shine, if you like, but his peculiar shine is very powerful. At this point, he's a man. He's been wandering the planes and realities for a long, long time, and unless you've read Hearts in Atlantis, you're not really going to know what's going on here. You really do need to have read that book to understand who this character is and why he's significant, why he can do what he does. He's a ruined and broken figure, but he's the one who ultimately ends up doing away with the Crimson King. He just rubs him out, draws him and rubs him out, and leaves just the eyes. There's just this set of mad staring eyes left on the balcony, and that's it. That's the end of the Crimson King. So the ultimate evil is just rubbed out, just done away with. And he's not much. He's really not much. It doesn't really come to anything. And that is very deliberate. Again, it's King trying to emphasize just how petty and mean and pathetic, like, malevolence actually is. He becomes his own end, ultimately. He has the chance to do what he's come to do, to topple the tower, and he doesn't. He ends up trapped because of his own pettiness and because of his own mean-spirited malevolence, and he ends up just this mad, lonely figure trapped on this balcony. It's kind of, it's either, you're either going to hate it or you're going to love it, you know? You are not going to get the big showdown with evil. You're not. It's just not here. It's not here. Roland really doesn't do anything at this point. It's not about, Roland is all about, he's the cipher at this point. He's there to continue the mythology of the tower. That's it. That's all he's there for. And the book makes that very plain. I mean, the ending for Roland is sad as hell. It's sad as hell. When he again, I'm assuming you've read it, so you know this is a massive spoiler. When he opens the door inside the Dark Tower and finds himself in the desert again, the first desert where we found him in the gunslinger, and he realizes what's going to happen, i.e. he's going to be sucked through, he's going to forget, and he's going to start the whole thing over again. The sheer terror and despair, because he realizes that he's walked this path thousands of times before, and he hasn't gotten it right. And there's a moment of absolute existential despair for Roland Deschain. And in a way, the book kind of says, you know what, you fucking deserve this. You've been marketed as the hero this entire time, but in reality, you're just the cipher for the story. That's all you've ever been. You're a tool of the tower. You are a product of the tower, and you are here to serve this purpose. But also, you've been awful. Before people came along who tempered you a little bit, you were a very bad man. You murdered, you left people to die, you abandoned all of your friends in this search for the tower, you became obsessed, and you caused immeasurable harm because of it. And he acknowledges that, he realizes that. And this is kind of his punishment. For that. There is only one sliver of hope. In this mythology, the Horn of Eld that Roland was carrying when he first set out as a boy is broken, it's lost. In this version, when he wakes up in the desert again and he starts to forget everything that's gone before, he's still got the horn with him and it's whole. So the implication is if he manages to carry that horn to the gates of the tower in this cycle and blow it, then things will be different. Then the state of reality will be different and the story will end differently. But here, in this version, it's just another cycle. And that's kind of cool, I've got to say. I like that myself. I know a lot of people who don't. I know a lot of people who are massively disappointed by this book, who really, really, really didn't like it, and felt that it didn't pay off the epicness of this mythology or its characters. I actually appreciate how understated it is. I do think that King struggled with this one. You can sort of feel it. You can sort of feel that King maybe didn't know quite how to end it. There is that feeling. about the whole thing. There's a few odd deviations in the book. Mordred is kind of nothing. He doesn't really do much and doesn't really serve much purpose. It would have actually made way more sense if he and Walter did get to the tower together, and Walter and him are waiting for Roland when he arrives, and it's a showdown. Who gets into the tower? Who is the one who gets to shape the nature of reality? That's kind of what the story was leading up to, but it doesn't give you that. It's kind of odd. It's kind of deliberately anticlimactic, and whether that's a good choice or a bad choice, it kind of depends on it depends on where your money lies. It depends on what you're going to bring to the story and what you want from it. I liked it quite a lot myself. There's an odd deviation with a creature called Dandello, who it transpires is a similar entity to Pennywise. He's of a similar species, but he feeds off of comfort and contentment rather than fear. So he gives people fantasies of comfort and drains them dry based on that. But he's a very similar creature to Pennywise. He even transforms into a similarly spidery monster. He's a creature of the Prim. He's basically a creature of Lovecraftian primordial chaos. But it's kind of a deviation. The only reason that exists is so that you can find the character from Hearts in Atlantis, who is a prisoner of this creature. But it does seem to be a weird deviation, to be honest. It seems to be a slightly weird deviation. I enjoyed this one quite a lot. Is it the ending that people would expect from a series this epic? Probably not. Probably not. It doesn't give you, for example, like comparing and contrasting, like, say, Clive Barker's Imagica, which is similarly huge, draws a similarly massive mythology that's as epic in its scope and its metaphysics, but does have a payoff at the end. It pays off everything. It ends really well. This one doesn't necessarily, but then again, it leaves you with the lingering ghost of an ending to come. It's a very strange way of ending the series. I quite like it myself. Now, we said at the beginning that it may or may not be the end, and that's because there's still so much to explore. I mean, we could look at some of the links with King's other work, like, for example, The Talisman, The Tears of the Dragon, Hearts in Atlantis, Desperation. There are links to myriad other works here. Black House, for example, the sequel to The Talisman. Black House has direct links to the Dark Tower, and actually spells out part of the core mythology of it, which is the notion of the Breakers, the psychic children who are being hoarded together to break the Dark Tower down. That kind of thing is all explained in Black House rather than in the Dark Tower. There's also the comics. The comics are very good. The comics are absolutely wonderful. They present a kind of alternative timeline to this one, which may actually be the timeline that occurs after this. It may be that one, and presents you with a really wonderful visual retelling of some of the stories that have already gone, but also contains a couple of new stories and new elements as well. It goes deeper into the relationship between the Crimson King and Arthur Eld and all that kind of thing. You get a lot more of the Crimson King, actually, in this one. He's a much more of a present entity here, which is actually really interesting. And some of the depictions of the Crimson King are wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Barring that, there's a load of other stuff as well. There are little short stories. There's a lot that we could go into. But the problem is, if you go into it too deep, then you end up writing books about it. There are entire books that spell out or explore the links between the Dark Tower and other mythologies and other stories and whatnot, because really you could tie the Dark Tower to almost every story King has ever written. There are possible links, and in some, overt links between them all. We may go and have a look. It'll only be it'll be a very, very brief once-over. It will not be in any great depth. It really won't. And we'll probably only look at the books where there are direct links, like Hearts in Atlantis. But really, for now, that is it. That unless King writes some more stories in the Dark Tower, which he might, he may come back to this mythology at some point. He has already with The Wind Through the Keyhole, so there's no reason why he shouldn't. That is the end of it. That is the end. It's it's one of those stories that you read for the story. It's the main part of the quest and whatnot that is the most compelling, the most engaging. It's all about the characters, it's all about their interactions. It's not about the end. It really isn't about the end. And if your reliance is upon the end, then you're probably going to be disappointed. Unfortunately, you are probably going to be disappointed. But the body of the series is well worth your time. It's a very beautiful piece of work and phenomenally huge. I mean, the ambition behind this is insane. It is absolutely insane. Whether King will revisit it in times to come, who knows? Who knows? But I kind of hope he does. I kind of hope he does come back at some point and maybe write something tangentially related, or maybe an insert story or something like that. He could even, if he wanted, he could explore how the story after this pans out. You know, how the next cycle actually pans out. He could do that. There's potential there. But until then, my dears, bye-bye.